Okay, welcome back everybody, and we're going to get started. And next up we have our colleague from ATU Donegal, Letterkenny, and Dr. Bronagh Heverin, who's representing the programme team as part of our Reimagining Assessment and Feedback for Student Success. And Bronagh is going to look at a review and evaluation of the introduction and application of the ABC Learning Design methodology in the programme in Donegal, which he'll tell you more about in a moment. Thanks, Bronagh.
And thank you, Karina. Good morning, everybody, and delighted to be here on behalf of Donegal ATU. But as you can see, there's a bit of a residual identity issue in the sense that I'm still up as LYIT on the PowerPoints. Is the PowerPoint playing now, or? Brilliant. Thanks a million. So thank you, Karina, for the introduction. And as I've said, I'm here from Donegal ATU, notwithstanding the footnote on the PowerPoint throughout. So effectively, I suppose the first thing is to say that I'm taking a different approach to this presentation to the others that have gone before, in that I'm going to be looking at programme level, because that was one of the, I suppose, objectives for us in coming on stream in this project, which has been a great opportunity, is that we were using it as an opportunity to review our programme assessment practices generally. So I'm going to, in this presentation, I'm going to just set the context where we were when we came onto this project, what we have tried to do since in adopting the ABC Learning Design methodology, and a review, how did it go, how did we feel it went. So just to give you a bit of that context to start with, well, Deirdre McClay is the project lead, and firstly I want to give her apology. She couldn't be here today, but she has been an invaluable part of the delivery and implementation of this project, so thanks to Deirdre in her absence. I'm from the programme, which is the BA in Law with Criminal Justice, and it's part of our Law, Public Service and Education Department, where we have two law programmes. And the LLB is a 3-year programme, which is very much focused on the heavy legal subjects, whereas the BA in Law with Criminal Justice is a entry-level 3-year level 7 programme, and they can do an extra year to make it a level 8 programme. Both of them are qualifying law degrees, but because the BA in Law with Criminal Justice is over 4 years, there's more scope for adding a variety of usually more practical modules. In line with that, then, our focus through both programmes is on experiential learning, and that goes back to our historic origins as an RTC, where we were always more vocationally orientated, and we've continued that. But it has also served to make us quite a unique provider of law programmes, where we positively recognise and endorse experiential learning. And that's reflected in the forms of assessment that we use, and here are some of those examples. And we've heard a lot this morning about authentic assessment, and that's definitely the core of experiential learning, and definitely it makes the using experience to learn makes and assess our students, makes it valid, makes it authentic. And Naomi mentioned it as a form of professional identity creation. It definitely does that, and that helps us in terms of engagement and retention, which is valuable for our programmes and our students as well. But in terms of the overall programme design, and this is just going back to our programme assessment design, this is going back to where we were in September. And effectively, I presume you can probably all relate to this type of setup in terms of designing how a programme is assessed. On a modular basis, it's down to the individual academic, and they have great latitude in terms of how they decide to assess the learning outcomes for their individual module. We're a little bit more constrained than other programmes because we have professional accreditation tied in. So for 8 core law programmes, we are tied to a 70% exam, has to be. So we use the other programmes and that 30% CA to try and put in as much applied learning as we can. Once the individual lecturer has determined what their ideal assessment approach is, we then at the start of each semester we have programme team meetings where we try to make sure that there's a good variety of assessment, that it's spread fairly over the semester, and that ultimately determines what will go into the assessment schedule. And again, I would say this is familiar to everybody in the sense that this is what's provided to the students. They're obviously not privy to our meetings and how we came up with what we decided to include. So what they're furnished with is this type, and this is literally what we would have furnished to our first years coming in last September. And it's a pro forma table. We don't design it, it's one that's for the institute, and we have to come within it. So the key things I'd say, if you were a student, what would you be looking at there? There are probably dates is probably the key thing that they look at. You might hope that they would look at the types of the coursework and they'd look and see if there's a good variety in there. And in first semester, it's not too bad. There's a good spread and the dates are well spread out as well. Moving to a later year just to see how it might change, and I suppose they're definitely much more attuned as to what it might include, so they would be very focused on the date. But at a real easy glance, and this is semester 5, so that's our 3rd years coming back, you can now see that it's much more difficult to spread. It tends to, the actual assessed activities are towards the end of the semester. There's still a good variety of activities, and I suppose if you're looking at it then from an assessment practice approach, ideally, our assessment is matching our learning outcomes. And if you look at there is a column in there where you have to tick, it's hard to read it sideways, but learning outcomes assessed via coursework. Do you see it going up sideways? And you can see that nearly all of them, all of the learning outcomes are assessed through the coursework. But that's not really very indicative of the type of learning that the students, so there's no real direct reference to learning. If I'm a student, I can see the dates and the type of assessment, but I don't really see what kind of learning is being assessed. But as I say, that's a pro forma form which we're constrained in that we have to use it. We also found a particular difficulty for us in that the types of coursework actually don't really very well describe the coursework that we do, but we had to tick the boxes within the form that was given to us as well. So that's where we were coming into it, okay? And then coming onto this project, it was hearing about ABC Learning Design Framework was new to us. And we understand that it's well established in Galway, which is great. It's a little bit more established than us in Sligo, but it wasn't like, we heard of it first through this project. We subsequently discovered that last year our flexible and online learning unit had adopted some of its practices. But they had the practices there, they didn't tell us what it was grounded on, so it's kind of a reverse engineering of it. Maybe we know about it, we didn't know we knew about it, so it was new to us. So just for those who aren't, I know most of the people here probably know it, are very familiar with it, but ABC, I like the ABC tag on it, because to me that sounds like, oh, it must be very easy, even though then when you look at it, that isn't actually why they put the ABC on it at all. It's because it stands for ARENA, which is the UCL Student and Education Experience Centre, where this design framework originated. B is for blended, which is again post-pandemic, that's very understandable to all of us. We mightn't have been so au fait with blended before that. And then connected, I think, is probably for me the most important letter. That whole idea of alignment through a programme, that it doesn't stand alone, that there's some plan to make sure that the activities connect with the assessment. And then again, just very basically giving an overview of how it works in practice. Effectively, it's based on, and I know Susan referenced it earlier, so this is ABC on speed. It's based on the 6 learning types identified by Professor Laurelan, and you're presented with cards, and on the front of the card it describes the nature of the learning type. So the first one up there is acquisition, which we'd all hope that they learn some content knowledge during the course of their programme, and then on the back it tells you how they might do that, and you tick those as you go through. So the idea of, you come in with these resources which are Creative Commons licensed, so anybody can use them, and you then go effectively try to create a visual storyboard for your particular course, where you have learning activities aligned with your learning outcomes, and then ultimately your assessments. There's a lovely continuity going along, and you allow for both formative and summative assessments. So that's a really brief intro to it. But as I say, we knew nothing about it in September, so we had to, if we were going to adopt this in Letterkenny, we had to learn all about it. And our overview of how we went about doing it was as well, first of all, Deirdre and I had to learn about it, so induction of the project team. We then had to share that learning with the programme team back in Letterkenny. We then went and had individual workshops on a singular module with each lecturer on the programme, so they applied the ABC learning design to their particular module. We then brought them all back and did the same thing over the entire programme. We then set off implementing it, and then we reviewed it. So a very quick overview of all of that. So in terms of induction, again, thanks to this project, Karina facilitated a workshop, and we were very fortunate in that DCU in the same month had another online workshop where they had been part of an Erasmus project with the originators of the ABC Learning Design in converting it all to online. I think it was coincidental with the pandemic rather than as a result of the pandemic, but it was very fortunate. But both of those set us up very well in terms of how does this work. So hopefully we knew what we were doing. We then had to pass that on to our academic staff, and we did pretty much, we replicated what we had been through in terms of how it works. The lovely thing for us is our programme focuses on experiential learning. Learning about the ABC Learning Design Framework was all experiential learning. It wasn't a case of, this is how it's done and you got a lecture on it. It was all very hands-on. How do you do it, okay? In terms of, I suppose you could, the resources, as I said, are Creative Commons license. We decided when we were going to apply it in Letterkenny that we would do it all face to face. And I suppose there were two reasons for that. One was that it was a reaction to too much online and we needed nearly the re-socialisation with the programme team. It was a good idea to get everybody back together. But the second thing was that we found that doing it physically was a much more interactive experience than doing it online. I mean, sliding things around the screen, it's really easy to do, but you don't engage as much. So we had one genius idea and we got very sustainable, wipeable whiteboards of the sheet, basically the overview sheet that you use, and then you place the cards along it. And I'll show you from examples from what we did. But this worked really well because you can imagine you put a card down here, then as you look at it, then you can move them over here, move it back here. It's just a very visual and very physical experience, which we found worked really, really well. So that's how we decided to approach it. I should say we thought it would work really, really well because it's over to the staff to decide, did it work really, really well? And I'll come back to that. So as I say, following telling them about how it works in general, we then set up individual meetings with each member of staff on the programme team. They picked a module they wanted to apply this ABC Learning Design Framework to, and we held a workshop with them where we reviewed it. So for those of you who've participated in an ABC Learning Design workshop before, there's a very prescribed format for it, which makes it really easy to deliver. So you've got to decide on your general learning objectives for the module in a very brief tweet. They tried to make you really consolidate what you want to get out of it. You've then got to map your learning activities as it stands. In other words, in terms of the 6 learning types, how much of each are you currently doing? And that's very visual. Again, it's on a spider type diagram and you place them in terms of how much you're doing of each. And then you review it and decide, well, do I want to stay there? Do I want to move out? And the good thing about this framework is there's no right amount of anything. It's not a case of having, I was going to divide 6 into 100. Thankfully, it doesn't go. You don't have to have an equal apportionment. It's a case of what's valuable to you in your particular learning outcomes. It's all about making sure that whatever activities you choose, whatever learning activities you choose, align with your learning outcomes. So that mapping exercise is really, really good because we can. You can imagine that we're so conscious of content, you can overweigh, if you want to call it, the acquisition part of it. And when you look at it then, you see it's really skewed and they're actually not doing anything with all that knowledge, so you need to change it. But mapping the learning activities was really, really useful. And you then set about creating the visual storyboard. For us, so this is at the first picture here is at the stage of the creation of the visual storyboard. We tended to do it, and again, this is just the way you can map it whatever way you want. We tended to do the timeline across the top and then divide it into content areas going down the side and then break them up into, what you do as you go across them. So we started off by literally mapping the content on that, and this was for the criminal practice module. And you can see the topics down this side and then how they're broken down. Having done that, then we come back and overlay the cards on top of it in terms of how did they achieve that? How was that delivered? And the second slide shows ultimately how that was delivered for that particular module. And you can immediately see now the difficulty, like if the cards, if there are more than one, you have to, obviously overlay them like that. But at a very quick visual glance, you can see if there's a dominance of a particular learning activity. And that could be fine, because that could be exactly what you want to really run through your module. But it gave a really good, quick idea of how you would, what you were asking your students to do. Having done that, then you go, and as I say, on the rear of each card are the particular activities. You tick those off. These are not reusable, so the lecturer takes these away with them. But having done that, you then go back and you mark on that setup where you're going to have formative and summative assessment. And this is where we go back to play school and we start playing with stars. So silver stars for formative and gold stars for summative. But again, a really good visual, a good takeaway, as in, yeah, I can see that when they get to the summative, they've done the formative that builds it up to that. And it certainly, aesthetically, it was very pleasing. All right, so we'll go back to whether it worked or not in a minute, but it looked good anyway. So that was at a module level. And as I say, we did it with every individual academic for one module. We then brought them together and did it at a programme level. And this was, I suppose, the idea of this particular project is actually to review assessment practices across the project. And equally, you can see yourselves, again, that it's, there are, at a glance, that's semester 1 and 2 of first year. And we had more latitude in the first semester because we consciously don't give them as many exams, whereas in the second semester, we're tied into the exams at the end of semester, which doesn't really match, directly any of the learning types, because it's more, you could say it's production, but it's I suppose it's not as active maybe as some of the other types. But again, a really good way of showing the programme, and we would be doing the exact same thing we did it for every year as we went along. And the key thing with this is that we noticed that generally in the more senior years, we tended to require them to do lots of things at the same time, whereas earlier on you were trying to be a bit more isolated, you weren't mixing, you were focusing on particular learning activities at an earlier stage. And ultimately we had the 4 years of the programme mapped out like this, which is a very good overview of what we wanted the assessment practices to look like throughout the programme. So that all looks great. We then came to implementation, and effectively it was then hands off from us as the project, because it was over to the particular lecturers in terms of, as it always is, what they decide to deliver in reality. Our key thing was then coming back to, well, did it work, right? So this is what brings us to today. At the end of the semester, just in the last few weeks, we then thought about evaluating it and reviewing it. In doing that then, as a starting point, we were fortunate that Erasmus project that was carried out by DCU and UCL, they had a participant evaluation survey. So I used that as a starting point in terms of how did they assess whether it worked or not, and it would also be useful for us in terms of comparing how we found it with what they found. So a quick summary of the results of what we found. So the first thing is we had to see where they thought we sat at the outset. So to do this, it simply asked every academic to 3 words which summarised how, our current assessment practices. And we were obviously delighted to see that collaborative and experiential came up, because that is what we do try to focus on. And there were lots of other good words in there, and hard to read, maybe focused, considered, measured, guided, innovative. But equally, like everything, there's room for improvement. So I've highlighted out a little bit more there. Sometimes it's confusing, inconsistent, a bit random. And this is, how the overall programme assessment might be perceived. So we definitely had issues to address. And then the key was then, would this ABC learning design framework address those issues? So the couple of things that we, again, using the precedent survey. So what kind of outcomes did it generate? So the first one is, and you can see the purple is when, a really good positive response. So the first thing it very clearly generated was discussion with colleagues about course design. So I think it's a lot about the creation of the time and space, because people would love to do this, but this allowed for that time and space, which was very, very well received. In terms of, and in an ideal world, you'd want to make sure that those discussions have as a backbone the teaching and learning strategy for the institute. That, it was good, it says to a great extent, so it probably was an opportunity to do that, which they wouldn't otherwise have, but room for improvement. The next one then, more confident in teaching and designing, and the redesign of the module. Again, not horrendous results, but there's definitely room to improve there, all right? So that's the kind of feedback you want. Like, it's something you can address. You need to increase confidence in terms of the actual doing of what the ABC Learning Design Framework allowed for. So what do they plan to do at the outcome of it, right? Well, the great thing is that you can see from the colours, like what came out first, the blue, implement redesign of course. So very, very positive. Having done the ABC Learning Design Framework workshops, they wanted to change. That's what you want. They wanted to take it on board. The second up then was marginally, and they were the same, was to discuss redesign of colleagues. And that's kind of good too, because we only had, individual workshops with each one and a programme, and we didn't have a lot. Like the good thing about the workshops is that they're only 90 minutes long. Generally, they do run on a bit if colleagues are interested, you know what I mean? But they're still quite concise. So it's good that they wanted to discuss it more. Like we'd be really I'd be worried if we came up with finite answers in one session. So that was good. And the next one is the same. Look for more information. So it opened doors, right? So they either wanted to implement or do something about it. But they, thankfully, we had nobody who said no plans in particular or do nothing with it. So that's kind of positive endorsement of it. Did you manage to implement them? And you can see very resoundingly a big no there, right? Now, the difficulty with that is that I suppose it's very real, and the reason cited was lack of time. So they were asked why, lack of time, and that resonates with what Naomi Winston said earlier on about time as one of the biggest barriers to implementing change. And I think probably being realistic about it, if we want to implement change, we probably need to think about it this year, but do it next year. Do you know what I mean? It's very hard to do it responsibly as you're actually participating in it. But one participant managed to actually implement it, which was, you know, a very good going. But I do think it would have been challenging, and it was a programmatic review year, so there was a lot going on. Maybe if you had a quiet year, you might have been able to do it at the time as well. If you didn't implement them, what do you plan to implement them in the coming academic year? And again, this is equally reassuring for all of those who didn't implement it this year. Do plan to do so next year. And the reasons why they didn't then, you know, why did you not manage this year? Too late. Intend to do next year. Insufficient time due to programmatic review. And being real about it, some found that colleagues were intransigent. You know, some people don't like change. They were, you know, this works, why change it? And you're going to have that. So, yeah, you know, again, you have to think of ways to get around that. But it is a real, I suppose, difficulty that you have to get over. Then looking at the programme workshops, and very briefly looking at what they looked at, and I have to apologise for the bottom of the table there because it is merging all of them together. So the first thing was, you know, did the programme workshop change your expectation of redesign? And you can see that to a great extent, so that was good. The second bar chart then relates to the discussion. Did it generate greater discussion? Not as much, but you know, it's still largely positive on it. The third thing then is in terms of will they implement, and definitely resounding positive that they will change it. And then the last one is did it, you know, make them more familiar with the teaching and learning policies of the institute, and that was very high. So I mean that, or not at all, that is, which means that they're very segregated, and we'll come back to that in the end in terms of what supports they need to actually, you know, follow through on these redesign of their assessments. In terms of the workshops, a very quick review of those. They were only 90 minutes long, and I think that really helped. So what did they think of the workshop themselves? Either good or excellent, so that's great. I think really key is that in terms of the resources, the same finding, and I think that's really often the tools that people need to make change. They need to have the resources to do it. The duration of it, perfect. And I think that is key to what makes this work. They're not very long, drawn out processes, and that makes it much more accessible and doable for the people involved. So in terms of then where, and this is my final slide, so you'll be glad here I'm at the end of where I'm going with this, so support going forward. What are the key ones that they want? They want more on assessment methods, so very practical. The second one then is teaching methods, it's the yellow, and the third one then are tools, all really practical resources. All of them are teaching and learning resources, and I suppose it reinforces the need for very strong teaching and learning support infrastructure in each of our institutes, but people would use them if they were there, and very, very practical supports are what they need. We were very lucky in the delivery of in this, I suppose, introduction of this ABC Learning Design Framework, in that it was a programmatic review year. So people were already in the zone in terms of reviewing their programs. I'm not sure how interested anyone would be next year. I hope they would be, but I mean, we have to be real about it. If, you know, it very clearly benefited them to be involved in it this year. We also have a relatively small programme team, 7 lecturers on it. So, you know, we would have fairly good communication already, and this allowed for that. But it certainly overwhelmingly positive response to the ABC Learning Design Framework. And if you just visually go back to the assessment schedule, which was furnished to students at the outset, which is still the one that's probably going to be there in September, and compare it with the very colourful integrated version that comes from the ABC Learning Design Workshop, the one key thing that's missing from the first one is learning. And I think for students to see the link between assessment and learning, I think our experience of this project really sells the idea that the assessment schedule needs to make a very direct connection with learning. A tick box for learning outcomes will mean nothing to our students, like particularly the way it was recorded, like yes, it meets learning outcomes 1 to 6, 1 to 7. You know, I couldn't relate to that because I'm not going to go and look up the module and see what they are. So I think, you know, showing that very clear link between learning activities and the assessment methods would be very beneficial for us in delivering, but also for students in participating in it. So that's effectively it this morning. Very practical, very beneficial. The one thing I will finish on is with the question. You know, I was listening to Naomi earlier, and she essentially said that if you want a consistent programme assessment practice, she thinks that it would be better to have principles rather than guidance. Now, for me, that runs counter to that. Like our ultimate feedback was we want practical supports and help and guidance. I don't know that having principles would be the way to address the needs of staff in making sure that it's a good programme assessment practice. But I'm throwing that out there as a question to finish on, because she's raised that as a question. All right, my learning from this was we need to get more supports. And now I'm not so sure if she thinks it would be easy to give them principles is what I'm thinking, but I don't know how beneficial it will be in practice. And that's eventually it. Am I in time?
Thanks, Bronagh. Brilliant. It's fantastic to see how it really took off in Donegal, and you and Deirdre are going to roll this out now for other programmes across yeah, and it's champions like you that we need to expand the engagement with that framework. So you had some super outputs, really, haven't you? Yeah, it's fantastic. Any questions for Bronagh? Oh, you're running away.
Time pressure, so I was kind of getting myself
No, we've time
sorry.
Any questions from the floor? Now, I know the medical science team went through the ABC framework prior to COVID. So I know perhaps they want to share their learnings from it.
Well, I think I'm so proud that you're at this stage. We went through it at a module level. Our ambition when we started this programme, and I'm probably preempting what I was going to say when I'm talking later, but our ambition was to look at redesigning and reimagining at the programme level. So this is really informative for us where we're at. So we have used ABC and it was really good. I enjoyed using it as well, and it was very helpful.
Can I just ask you a question just kind of related to that, but I suppose from your experience, Bronagh, looking at it at a programme level and even individual modules, do you think it was over kind of, was it a bit too much to ask to change everything? I know in the literature you'll see some where there'll be reference to just, a small change. So maybe kind of like what you're saying, that some of your colleagues will make one change maybe next year. But do you think that the ABC kind of programme, was it too much to ask that some people are like, no, I can't do it? Whereas if you had, would it be a good output to say, I'll identify one change and trial that 1 year? Did you get any kind of sense of that? That's a
really good question, because I think the first thing is, somebody said that they didn't identify that what they were already doing from Sligo, that it was already authentic assessment. I think actually a lot of people are doing really good stuff. I think it articulates what they're already doing. And I actually don't think it often will relate. It might change their presentation of what they're doing rather than what they're doing necessarily. So I just think it's a way of reviewing it to make sure for the alignment. I wouldn't go into it saying, and you're going to have to change. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think it's organic. It should emerge from doing it. Oh, I see how I can tweak that to capitalize on this to make that alignment better and clearer. So but that's a really good point, because if they think that what you're about to do is to say, well, all the assessments you've been doing so far are all binned and we're going, now you're going to have to change everything and want everything to be authentic. I think that's wrong, because I think there's really some really good assessments out there already, but I think it represents them in a way that's more. I think the key learning for me is that it's to get that connection to the students' learning, and you want to make it explicit for the academics, so they explicitly reference it to the students, but that the students can really see the connection between, I'm learning this because I'm going, you know what I mean? It just basically connects the dots.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with you. And I think too as well, sometimes we're obsessed with the learning outcomes and the assessments. I think sometimes we forget about the teaching environment, exactly. With in the constructive alignment, I think we forget about the three, into support as well. Yeah.
And if you look at that table that we start with, that's what that's all about. It has the learning outcomes, but they're all numbered, and then it has assessments. It's really, again, for students, if I were a student, the most I'd look at is the dates. Yeah. Do you know? And that's not the point of it,
Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Bronagh.